Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs that include our biweekly publication, the Global Taiwan Brief, our public seminars, an annual symposium, as well as scholarship opportunities and our podcasts. If you're not already subscribed to receive our updates directly in your inbox, you may do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. So let's begin today's program. I am truly delighted to be having this conversation with Josh Kurlantzick about his new book, Beijing's Global Media Offensive, China's Uneven Campaign to Influence Asia and the World, which was just published by Oxford University in December 2022. Josh is a senior fellow for Southeast Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he focuses on China's approach to soft and sharp power, including state-backed media and information efforts. Josh is a prolific book writer, and I couldn't recommend more to our audience, both the book that we are discussing here today, as well as, if you haven't read it already, his earlier book on China's charm offensive in Southeast Asia, which was published, I believe, in 2007, where then you can really fully take stock of the shift in China's approach from the late 2000s to now. Needless to say, Josh has been tracking and studying and writing about these issues that we will be having an in-depth discussion about here today for quite a very long time. And so we're very fortunate to have Josh here to share some of the insights from his newest book. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me, Russell, and thanks. I don't know if you remember, but we had a sort of early in this process a book study group where we talked about some of the themes of this, and it was a pleasure to have you participate in some of that as well to help shape the book.
That was great. No, thank you very much. So, Josh, with all of our book talks, one of the things that I really like to give our the authors a chance to do is to get into sort of the motivation and the reason for writing the book. So, to sort of kick things off here. So, can you tell our audience members a little bit about what motivated you to write this book?
Sure. Well, when I wrote that earlier book in 2000, it came out in 2007, Charm Offensive, but it really was written in like 2004, 2005, and then published in 2007. And at that time, China was still sort of more of a novel diplomatic actor in Southeast Asia, not with Taiwan, but and on the globe. And they had ramped up their soft power offensive, which I call the charm offensive, in Southeast Asia and other regions. There are a whole wide range of things: cultural diplomacy, educational diplomacy, aid, formal diplomacy, and they were presenting themselves as a different kind of power from the U.S., one that didn't interfere in other countries' affairs. Of course, this was not true, but I'm just telling you how they presented themselves. One that would be a different type of power, and one that was going to be a major power, but was going to be somehow in a way different from the US, and especially particularly supportive of developing countries in various ways that the US had not been. And they had a fair amount of success with that, in particular in Southeast Asia, because at that time they were not quite as militarily assertive and diplomatically assertive, and their popularity ratings in a lot of developing regions and their appeal in Taiwan to some extent was relatively significant. I'm not saying that if you look at polls at that time that people in Taiwan wanted to reunify with the mainland, but it was a striking difference from today. I wanted to then we go forward 10 years, basically, when I started working on this book in 2017. And so what I wanted to see was, now China's assuredly a major world power, the second most powerful country in the world. They have now, under Xi Jinping, become much more authoritarian. They have basically dropped the fiction that they don't interfere in other countries, although sometimes they still refer to that, but they basically dropped that fiction. I mean, Xi Jinping has given major speeches basically saying that China has prominent speeches saying that China has a model of development for other countries. He couldn't be more interventionist than that, really, in terms of at least ideologically. And they were aggressively, militarily, much, much more aggressive in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, with India, et cetera. And they were much more diplomatically aggressive on the world stage. So what I wanted to see was, were they going to be able to pull off this very delicate balance in which they were now ascending to great power status and much, much more assertive, and that can definitely scare people, while also maintaining the ability to retain high popularity, decent popularity levels, and woo other countries through sophisticated diplomacy and media and information, or not. And this is obviously a balance the United States has struggled with for decades, as we've been the biggest power in the world and haven't always pulled it off. Scare some countries, but other countries have been able to reassure them that despite the United States being really powerful, we have their best interests at heart and et cetera. And then the book developed into looking at the ways China was trying to mitigate the anger and concern that was rising among other countries about its assertiveness. And so I focused on a few different areas. One was how they used their state media. Two was how they tried to control the Chinese language media in various places, including Taiwan, so the domestic Chinese language media. Three was their growing use of information and skill in using information and disinformation on social media platforms. Four was controlling like the pipes of information, like how information is transmitted. So that includes both apps and platforms like TikTok, but actually also the actual physical infrastructure, like undersea cables and building 5G. And then five was just what I called old-fashioned influence, which is just like paying politicians, using the United Front Work Department to bully or alter or change or affect student associations and groups and things like that. And so that was the motivation. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Josh. And then you get into some of the issues I wanted us to dive into already as well. But before we get too far, I just wanted to remind our audience members that we do want to take questions from our live audience members. And so you may submit your questions to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or you could use the chat function on the YouTube page where you may be viewing this event. So we'll reserve around 25 minutes close to the close of the event for that. So please have your questions ready. You may submit them at any time you'd like throughout the point of this discussion. So Josh, I mean, you touched on this already, and you mentioned that obviously this book is essentially about how China is using the media and information for its strategic objectives. And can you kind of tell our audience and provide maybe a brief overview of what the PRC is doing in these spaces, and how does it, how does it support its goals?
Okay, so I mean, I think it's the major goals that it seeks or it sought, because I think a lot of these goals have been undermined dramatically by the last 3 years of COVID disaster in China and a slowing economy. And it's an open question, and it's a good question about whether China can adapt and regain some of its appeal in the world when it's shown itself. I should have said that the COVID disaster plus openly supporting Vladimir Putin, which has in the war in Ukraine, which has also costed a lot of popularity on the world stage. I actually have a separate publication put out by CFR that looks at China's popularity, and it's in most liberal democracies around the world, including some in Asia, China's popularity is at its worst images at its worst in decades.
Mm.
So the expansion of state media and the control of Chinese language media outlets and the growing sophistication in information, I think, are designed to do several things. One, the Chinese leadership is obsessed with this idea of discourse power. They've talked about that for decades. And what it means to them is that, like, global narratives about China, as well as issues that are not necessarily only about China, but related to China, are dominated by politicians from liberal democracies who set the discourse and media from liberal democracies. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the BBC, the Nikkei, the Yomiuri Shimbun. We could go through a whole list of them, but CNN, and that those major media outlets set the global narratives about China, and that China is somehow unable to speak for itself or push back against it. So they wanted to, over the last 10 years, so that's point one that I think they wanted to achieve. And so over the last 10 years, they spent huge amounts of money expanding China Global Television Network, which is their global TV network, China Radio International, which is their global radio network, and Xinhua, which I think we know what it is, but it's the main newswire. We could get to this later, but I think the first two efforts failed. China Global Television Network and China Radio International, where they initially spent huge sums and hired a lot of actual quality foreign reporters in a whole range of countries and made some efforts to make them more credible, failed completely, because as Xi became more authoritarian, those networks just couldn't produce anything but outright turgid propaganda. I think their goal originally was to make those networks something like Al Jazeera, like networks that were based in an authoritarian state and that didn't produce fair reporting about that state, but that produced other good reporting and people would start to turn to. But the difference is that Al Jazeera is based in Qatar, a tiny monarchy that, there was the World Cup recently, so people pay attention to Qatar, but most of the time, Qatar's domestic politics are not major issues in the globe, whereas it's really impossible to have a global television or radio network where they don't say anything independent about China and you expect people to trust them. Whereas by comparison, Al Jazeera can cover all sorts of things not related to Qatar and produce some good reporting. Xinhua, however, I think has been a significant success in this discourse power. The reason for that is that Xinhua is, unlike the other two, where you have to actively look to find China Global Television Network wherever you are, or China Radio International, you don't have to look for Xinhua. And so Xinhua has signed content sharing agreements with news outlets all over the world, primarily in Southeast Asia and other developing regions, but other places as well. And they're signing more and more because Xinhua is often offered cheap or free to news outlets. And so in places like Thailand or Malaysia or other places like that, you increasingly have Xinhua content appearing in local news outlets in local languages instead of content from Bloomberg or Reuters or the Kyoto or the Associated Press or whatever. And most news consumers in places like this, and also news consumers just everywhere, even in the US, don't usually pay a lot of attention to where the stories are sourced from. I mean, that's true in the US too. And so you're increasingly having a situation in which Xinhua copy is being used in a lot of countries. And that's really, really problematic because in the long term, that gives the possibility that Xinhua will increasingly set the narrative in those countries about China.
Josh, we can step back
let's just stop there. I was going to talk about Chinese language media, but I don't want to go too long.
No, that's we can get to that later, or if there's or people can just buy your book and read about it because it's you do cover it extensively. But I mean, more on the conceptual side, I do want to, before we drill in on a lot more on some of the analytical judgments that you make in this book. But really, you make I think a very important distinction about the way in which China uses media and information can be divided on a base, in two forms, right? As a form of sort of soft power and as a form of sharp power, right? And I think that's an important distinction to make between the two. And I think maybe just for our viewers who may not be or uninitiated on these terminologies, why are these terminologies important? Define these terms, and then can you give like an example of each before we
Sure.
move a little further?
Okay, so soft power is generally conceived of the idea that you're doing various things. Either you, the country, are promoting these things, or without any support from the actual government, these things are happening, and they make your ideas or your culture or your government appealing to other countries, people in other countries, and that appeal is an appeal of attractiveness, and so therefore could have, in the long term, that attractiveness could help. You can't prove this definitively, but could help boost your popularity and therefore make your foreign policy more easier. So you could have soft power directed by a government. So like in the United States, we have Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and those are tools that are openly out there. They're not concealed. And the US government uses those to sort of provide independent reportage about the US and about places in Asia. But you can also have soft power that's not directed by the government. And in fact, most of the United States soft power, what has historically made the United States appealing to other countries, has really nothing to do with the government. People are interested in the United States because they are interested in maybe some of the ideas in the United States, or they're interested in that, they are Hollywood, or they're interested in what is put out on Netflix in the United States, or they're interested in the NBA, or they're interested in famous American music, or et cetera. So soft power isn't necessarily directed by the government, or there can be, but it's things that make your government more attractive and that are done transparently. They're not hidden. So that would apply to that would still apply to China's media outlets, as well as China's artists, writers, etc. The problem is that China has basically repressed all those writers. So to take one other just brief example of this, Korea has amassed massive soft power, where Korea has suddenly become this incredibly, to many foreigners, interesting country, attractive, appealing country. People want to know more about it, not because because Korea has developed this massive global entertainment industry, developed in Korea, but has the most popular band in the world. Not a band I'm a fan of, but I have nothing against them, but they have developed, major films and prominent TV shows, et cetera. And so that soft power reflects back on Korea, et cetera. Sharp power is something where it's not transparent, and it's usually done by the government or government-related entities. And it involves things where the government or government-related entities are using opaque, often corrupt or corrosive means to affect and influence other societies, particularly done by authoritarian states and used to control or censor in other countries, possibly engage in corrupt activities like paying politicians, et cetera. So an example of a sharp power effort would be efforts by the United Front Work Department. I can define that later if we need to, but to wield power in a place like Australia, threaten students, and try to force self-censorship on university campuses about China. Another obvious attempt would be sharp power effort would be simply outright. There's been multiple scandals in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. To just speak about Taiwan, I don't want to, but allegations that without transparency, certain Taiwanese media groups allegedly have been directed explicitly by the Chinese government's Taiwan office to make certain statements that support certain candidates. That's sharp power. There's no transparency. The transparency was brought to it by reporting about it, et cetera, but it was all done under the radar and with the intention of not boosting the appeal of China, but undermining, corroding, corrupting, defacing the other country.
Yeah, I want to, I do want to get to audience Q&A, and we can certainly have this conversation for a very long period of time. But a couple of questions before a few questions before I turn over to the audience Q&A is, and I'm just being cognizant of our time here, is what in your view then are the most effective and perhaps least effective tools of Beijing's sort of information media and influence campaigns, and also while we're on this topic, what are the most effective and ineffective countermeasures? Because we want to be able to address that that other side of it too as well.
Well, I already touched on one of them. I mean, I think Xinhua is a really big problem for the global information, for global media and information. I mean, the media industry in the world, in developed and developing countries alike, is not in good shape, hasn't been in good shape for a long time. In the book, I talk about how more journalists have lost their jobs between the early 2000s and mid 2010s in the United States than coal miners. So it's not like a great, an industry with a great future, except for at a few elite U.S. news outlets. So I think that's a huge problem with Xinhua becoming regarded as a newswire in a lot of places on the level of the Associated Press or Bloomberg, and then you have China delivering via Xinhua the news to a whole wide range of consumers. That's a problem. Secondly, I think the much, much greater skill that China has amassed in disinformation. Like a lot of China's disinformation in Hong Kong and Taiwan in 2019 and 2020, there was a massive amounts, but it wasn't very sophisticated compared to, say, Russian disinformation that was used in Europe in the late 2010s and that was used in the United States in 2016. And in fact, I think a lot of the disinformation that China dumped on Taiwan in the presidential race actually backfired. China has become more sophisticated. That was true, and that I think is going to become more true. They've become better at understanding the organic divides within societies. So like in the US, Russia's disinformation is often played on organic divides in the US. So like they pick on divides like divides over racial justice or divides over gun control or things like that. And then they play on those on social media platforms to turn Americans against each other with the idea of suggesting that, America is in chaos or the democracy doesn't work, et cetera. This is all before the Ukraine war, where a lot of this has slowed down because Putin is just like, they're focused almost exclusively on the Ukraine war. China has become more sophisticated at that as well. And Taiwan is an obvious place where they play on organic divisions in society. They have for some time. Taiwan is actually like I'm not sure what the Silicon Valley term is, the beta test, I think, or the alpha test, the test of like this, where they have been playing on organic divides for some time and have gotten better at it. And I think that's going to expand in the future. And that's extremely problematic, especially at the same time when you have two things happening. The major social media platforms are dialing down content moderation, particularly Twitter. And China has its own massive platform, TikTok, which, in my opinion, is not long for this world in the United States, as well as many liberal democracies, but for now is an incredibly powerful and problematic platform. And then third, the increasing meddling in political campaigns, which is nothing new to Taiwan, but is new to places like Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, Malaysia, places like that, through backdoor payments and things like that, is severely, severely problematic. what can be done? I mean, I think all countries should be implementing foreign interference laws similar to what has been implemented in Australia, and which the US we have some elements of, preventing any foreign entities from making donations in politics. Those laws should also treat the media and information sectors as similarly sensitive as we have usually in the past treated sectors related to the defense industry. So, for example, the United States and other liberal democracies and Taiwan should analyze deals in which a foreign entity, it doesn't have to be Chinese, any foreign entity is planning to buy up major media or information outlets in that country with the same level of scrutiny as they might have in the past looked at a foreign entity that was going to buy up things that could also be used to make missiles or tanks or something like that. Because media and information today is in many ways as important as that. Third, one of the things that Taiwan has done pretty well, and which other countries or places should do, is try to improve citizens' digital literacy. Taiwan actually has some pretty good programs for that. That's still very nascent in the United States. I mean, my kids go to a elementary and middle school here where I live in Baltimore, and there's some digital literacy efforts, but in general, the United States is far behind on that. That would be definitely a boon, so that you can't just rely on Twitter or another platform or any platform. Citizens need to be informed about how to understand this information. And I'll stop here because I don't want to go on too long. I think that much more significant effort needs to go on to understand which of China's tools, and I talk about this in the book, in media, in information, in traditional influence like paying politicians, they're actually doing well in, and which they're actually not. Because if they're not doing well in them, first of all, the world is on fire, right? Like there's a land war going on in Europe for the first time since World War II. Like, I'm not a military expert, but obviously the situation around Taiwan and the South China Sea is extremely problematic. The United States is got its own problems, et cetera. We can't stop everything China is going to do. And so it's very important to have a better understanding of what they're doing successfully in terms of the media, information, and influence space, and what they're not. And if they're not doing it successfully, if their state media outlets are just a huge sink of money that have, other than Xinhua, that have no viewership or listenership, which is what I have found out, then let them continue to fail. I don't think, we need to focus on those things that they're doing well and concentrate on those.
No, that's excellent, Josh. And then, and I know we can get into a whole day-long conversation about, how to prioritize, and what to prioritize. And really the sort of the effectiveness of the various types of means of sort of information operations and influence operations that you've outlined in your book. And again, you go into a lot of details in your book, mapping the various ways that China is engaged in this influence offensive through media and information. But our time is limited with you, and I do want to turn quickly to our audience Q&A, and we do have a question from Dave Stillwell, who's out in Honolulu.
I know Dave Stillwell.
Yeah, Dave. Well, of course, I think we're all very familiar with Dave. And so his question turns on the question about the diaspora publication that you had mentioned earlier, and he said, which diaspora publications in the U.S. are clearly doing Beijing's bidding? It seems that there is a spectrum of PRC influence in regards to diaspora publications. Josh,
Thanks, Dave, Thanks for the question, Dave. I mean, I think just to step back a little bit, I think it's not just in the U.S. I mean, I think one of the things that China has done well is they have used local business people in countries ranging from Malaysia to Thailand to Australia to New Zealand to the United States, United Kingdom to Canada, primarily local business people, but occasionally in some of those Southeast Asian places, there's also been some element of Chinese companies or state firms playing a role to basically take over almost all the Chinese language media and shift it to being pro-Beijing. So that they're in places like Australia, Thailand, Malaysia, New Zealand, there's virtually Canada, there is almost no, virtually no Chinese language media left that is, except for a few small outlets, that is critical and independent and covers the PRC that way. And I think that's actually largely true of the United States. So Dave's asked a question about the spectrum. And I would, first of all, the best analysis of every single outlet was actually produced about 4 years ago by Hoover, where they have a report on China's influence in the US, and they go through every single outlet in their media section of a very long report on China's influence in the US. But I don't think there are really almost any outlets that produce critical independent reporting on China in the Chinese language media in the United States anymore, other than New Tang Dynasty TV, basically, and its associated properties, which does produce critical independent reporting, although they sometimes have problems with their sourcing, but they are at least trying to produce critical and independent reporting. There is definitely some degree of a spectrum, but it's very limited. I mean, you have the actual Chinese state media, which you can get on most or many cable systems in the US. That's obviously not independent. There's Phoenix TV, which is used to a long time ago have some degree of credibility, and that's available, and a fair number of Chinese speakers and viewers in the United States watch that because it's more interesting than state TV, and also because it was associated with Hong Kong. It was a little bit more independent of the PRC. There was periods where it covered some sensitive topics, like there was discussions on it a long time ago about Zhao Ziyang, the premier who was purged during Tiananmen, et cetera. But now Phoenix TV is essentially just another state TV organ. So there's that, which has a fair number of viewers in the United States. And then there's a bunch of locally owned outlets in the United States, based in the Bay Area, based in New York and other places. And again, the Hoover report goes through everyone one by one, but I mean, virtually all of them are owned by owners who are pretty much produce content that is either just elides issues of concern related to Beijing or outright pro-Beijing. And like I said, the same is true in most other countries, not necessarily. There are some exceptions. Taiwan, I mean, there are some, there is obviously independent and critical media in Taiwan. There were in Hong Kong. There's, some small Chinese language media outlets in addition to NTD TV in the United States that produce some critical reporting, but the buffet is very, very limited. And that is, again, also true for most of the other big liberal democracies with sizable Chinese listening, reading, and watching populations like Australia, the UK, and Canada. I mean, there's in Canada also where there had been in the past some degree of independence. That has dramatically changed. Like the local Canadian editions of the Hong Kong papers, which have a high degree of popularity in Canada, are basically just produce pro-PRC stuff now. The people who were independent editors and writers at those outlets in Canada have been fired or just left, et cetera. And so it's a fairly dispiriting environment, frankly.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, Josh. And I think, what I gather from, in reading parts of your book, and I think the point that you're making here right now in highlighting is, sort of the the symbiotic relationship between the sort of the information operations and that of the United Front work that is being done among the diaspora communities. And I think what you've documented and covered very extensively in your book and just now also as well is just showing how a lot of the information channels to the diaspora communities have now been essentially kind of hijacked and controlled by.
And if you add, sorry, just if you add to that, also a lot of diaspora communities also use WeChat, which is which is a tool that I understand is valuable for being in contact, with the other members of the diaspora community and with your own relatives in China. But the problem happens when obviously WeChat is not, an good independent source of news.
Right.
WeChat has been shown to have problems with monitoring data of people outside of China. And so you have places like I talk in my book in Australia where you have a lot of Chinese first readers and speakers getting their quote unquote news from WeChat, which isn't actually a news source, but WeChat is just recirculating information either from Chinese state media or from local Chinese media, which is also producing PRC content. And then it gets recirculated on WeChat, and maybe the person isn't actually reading the original pro-PRC news outlet, but it gets circulated through WeChat, so they pick up the news that way.
Yeah. No. So Dave had a follow-up question, and this relates to more sort of the on how the PRC may be adapting its information, campaign, and he references CRI, which is China Radio International, and he said that it basically was very active in Honolulu before, and it's had some qualitative difference to that of CCTV or CGTN, which appears to have suggesting that it was sort of a lower quality than CCTV, but CRI has kind of diminished in his observations with regards to, I guess, their activities and programming in Honolulu. You have any kind of sort of thoughts with regards to how China is sort of adapting and utilizing these various platforms differently? Any thoughts in terms of distinction of these various platforms and how they use them in their?
Okay, I think maybe there was some misconception. I said that CGTN and CRI were both not doing particularly well in terms of gaining viewers or listeners, and that Xinhua had, because it flies under the radar and you don't have to actively seek it out, that Xinhua is one to be more concerned about. But the second part of Dave's question, I think, is a very good one. I mean, I think it's always wrong to think that China, despite the fact that it has now shifted from a kind of authoritarian state that was more consensus authoritarianism in the Xiang and Hu eras, where it was certainly highly authoritarian, but decisions were made in a sort of collective group among a small number of people around the central leader to one-man rule, essentially, which is more unpredictable and probably generally historically problematic. It's always a mistake to think that that China is doomed. I think we have this tendency in any respect. I think we have this tendency in the United States, not necessarily in Taiwan, although Taiwan has, I was mentioning to Russell, at times exhibited perhaps a fair amount of too much complacency about certain things. But the United States has engaged in this cycle with China over the last 30 years where we switched from thinking that China is like incredibly powerful and is going to dominate us in various ways or dominate the world, to then thinking that China is doomed and it's going to collapse. And in reality, probably neither of these things, or the Chinese regime is going to collapse. Neither of those things is really true. And that we need to find some middle ground, like I said, where we assess China's strengths and weaknesses more accurately. But in terms of what David said, I think it's also a mistake to think that just because China is an authoritarian state, that they can't be adaptable. they may not be as adaptable as a democratic state or a state where there is greater feedback to the government, and they become less adaptable the more they move towards outright one-man rule. That makes things less adaptable, but they are still not North Korea or even Russia under Putin, I don't think. And they have shown in some other areas to have some degree of adaptability. So I think that it's wrong to think that just because some of these big state media outlets are failing, that they won't try to adapt them. But so for example, CGTN and CRI, I think the numbers show, and I have extensive numbers showing that they have almost no viewership or listenership. So they would be qualified as failing. I think it's wrong to think that China isn't going to try to do something with them. The problem is, like I said before, it's very problematic to do that and also be such a highly authoritarian and powerful state. I think it's possible that what happens is that they try to, with some of these, move them more into tools of sharp power so that they quietly sign content sharing agreements, like for CRI in particular, which is less well known than their TV network, with radio stations in developing countries and in places where there are less constraints on the media, and perhaps where China is still more popular, like Latin America, Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, so that CRI gets on the air on prominent local radio stations, and their content either gets on the air itself, or they sign deals where it then gets sort of amalgamated into content in local languages. So places like Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, places where that's possible. I mean, I think that's one possible adaptability. I frankly don't see how they can adapt the television network. They're not going to be Al Jazeera, like I said, because there's just too many issues of importance related to China. And if they don't give their reporters the freedom to have any credibility, the network will fail. But I think with the radio station, it'll become more of a tool of sharp power. It'll slowly get pushed into the local networks of many countries, particularly developing countries that don't have guardrails. And people will be listening to China Radio International, possibly not even realizing it, or China Radio International content in a lot of countries, particularly developing countries.
No, Josh, we had a question that I think relates to this interesting sort of internal-external dynamic of China's information control that you have sort of hinted at in your conversation with regards to just the amount of focus on China's domestic politics and how that distinguishes itself from other sort of state-sponsored media platforms. And the question is, does China devote proportional resources to its domestic information and media control as it does for its operations abroad? Does its efforts to control the narrative at home and international reflect its national security priorities as well? I know that your book is primarily about the global dynamics.
Sure, I can answer that. That's a great question. I mean, I think the book is primarily about internationally, but certainly the number one priority of the CCP and Xi Jinping still remains, will be, I mean, I don't think it's going to change, making sure that the CCP remains in power. All else is subservient to that first. The CCP remains in power, and for Xi Jinping, that Xi Jinping remains in power. So, I mean, no one can tell you the exact figure that China spends on controlling the narrative domestically, because you would have to figure in both the staggering sums they spent on creating the Great Firewall, plus the staggering sums they spent on surveillance tactics, plus the staggering sums they spend paying people to censor the domestic internet, plus the staggering sums they spend on their own domestic state media, plus whatever sums they spend on the actual state security bureau to follow and arrest and intimidate people. But I would say, just offhand, there's no doubt that they spend more money controlling the domestic narrative about the Chinese government and the CCP, because you also have to include the whole going down to the grassroots, where Xi Jinping has also recreated a system in which the CCP is much more involved in all sectors of society. So I would say with fairly strong confidence, even though that's not my area of expertise, that they spend way more money controlling the narrative and the image of the CCP at home and globally, because the most important thing to them, first of all, above all others, always, is that the CCP remains in power. The CCP is not toppled. There is no 1989. There is no color revolution, etc. So I would be shocked if they didn't spend more money on that. It's just that they have started to also spend significant amounts of money, trying to control the narrative globally.
Josh, I want to close with one last question, if I may.
Sure.
This is to sort of look forward, right? I mean, you wrote in your book, and I think it made a very interesting, this point, which is that, it will be easier for Beijing to bolster its information influence campaigns between now and 2030. So why do you think this is the case? And are there things that the United States and Taiwan should be doing now together to counter these trends?
All right, well, 30 seconds first as a disclaimer. So I wrote this book, and then, my publishers were kind enough to give me back the book, which was already done in early 2022, and allow me to add stuff about the war in Ukraine, which China actually was fairly popular in Central and Eastern Europe, had very good relationships with a lot of Central and Eastern European countries. They've completely flushed us down the toilet by supporting Putin. They allowed me to get back in, to put in the zero COVID disaster, which undermined China's model of supposedly effective managerial governance and authoritarian system. And they allowed me to put in some aspects of the ramping up of the situation around Taiwan. So in 2022, China made it a lot harder for it to do anything and get anywhere by 2030 through these three things. But I think that, sorry, tell me the first part of your question again, and then again, sorry, Russell,
Why is it the case that you think this is going to be the decade in which China is going to be able to bolster its information influence campaigns? And
okay. So I'm a little bit less confident of that now, but I mean, I think that we were seeing, breakdowns in democracies, problems with democracies, and that benefited China. I mean, I think before the Ukraine war, we were seeing, a lot of divisions among the United States and its allies. I think China has developed a pretty effective, one very effective tool, Xinhua, a second very effective tool, control of Chinese language media, and it's getting much more effective at influence operations below the radar. I think when I was writing the book, most liberal democracies did not really have a good sense of what China was doing, or hadn't passed laws, or didn't really have a good sense of how to combat it. That's changing a little bit. And so I think that China had the upper hand. Some of that they've squandered in the last year or two. I think that there's reason to believe that that the tide is turning somewhat. And I think that, I think that there's good reason to believe that the United States, at least the United States, Canada, some Western European countries, I believe Singapore's already done this, but some Southeast Asian countries, Japan, and others that are, Taiwan has already done some aspects of this already. In fact, already has some of these measures in place, are going to take more stringent measures and wake up and realize that China's in this decade has the ability to gain massive control over information and influence. And some of those measures have already been put into place. It's a question of whether, as China emerges from these debacles that it has put itself in, if once it untangles itself from its COVID debacle, and I don't know about with Putin, but at least from the COVID debacle, and again becomes a major world player again, whether these measures that countries need to put into place to sort of watch, stifle, prevent its information influence activities while remaining democracies. Like you can't illegally prevent a US citizen who wants to buy a news outlet and decides to take over that news outlet and change the editorial content. You can't just tell him or her, no, you can't do that. You just can't do that. But there are certain limitations as to what we can do in a democracy, right? Otherwise, we would have no partisan press at all, and we have tons of partisan press. But I mean, I think I'm actually more hopeful than when I was writing the book that a lot of major powers, as well as countries in Asia, are starting to wake up to this challenge. So I'm mixed on whether China is going to be able to expand some of these activities, nefarious activities, by 2030.
Well, one thing can be sure is that, if policymakers in democracies, get your book and learn from, the playbook that Beijing is using in its global media offensive, that they would be better equipped to address, these issues. And so thank you very much, Josh. And I think you really covered these issues with great nuance that, hopefully was reflected in our conversation. But really in in great details and lucidity, you really covered this very, I think, important and critical issue to, our democracies and national security as well. So thank you very much for taking the time to share your insights with us and with our audience. For our audience members, make sure you pick up your copy of Beijing's Global Media Offensive. You can purchase that on I think most of your online and in-store locations. So thanks again, Josh, and
thanks, Russell, as always.
Take care.
All right, take care.